I was reminded during the break, or just before the break, Michael and I were speaking and reflecting on the way men and women communicate and using those 4 points of communication. And see if this resonates with you, that a lot of the time when women speak, they make eye contact, so they use that intimate form of communication, but men would often speak by standing side by side and looking out. Perhaps they're not... I don't know any studies about that make sense of that observation, but it seems to ring true to me. And I wonder, as a female practitioner, when you speak to men, whether it is worth sitting side by side rather than face on if you have something difficult to say. Just something to think about. I don't know any. I can't offer you any studies on that, but just an observation. For the next little bit, and it won't be as long as the last one, we're just going to talk about how you can receive messages in a way that is more likely to effectively hear what's being meant. I meant that hear what's being meant rather than what's being said. Listening. So again, we're very good listeners as lawyers. We have to be. We have to hear instructions. We have to hear judges' comments. We have to hear what other people say. We spend a lot of time hearing and a lot of time listening. But I think sometimes there is room for improvement, even in myself, which is hard to believe, isn't it? To listen effectively so that you minimise the risk of getting it wrong, of not hearing the meaning of what's being said, is a very difficult task. It requires us to simultaneously maintain 3 streams of attention, giving attention to someone. Before I go into that, think about 3 people in your life you've encountered who you consider to be exceptionally good listeners. Bring them to mind. Has anyone thought of someone they didn't like, love, or respect? The studies show that if you encounter or you present as a good listener, that 90% of people will describe the relationship with you or describe you as someone they like, love, or respect. So listening is a really important gift you can give to the formation of a relationship. The first stream of attention is, of course, listening to the speaker's message. Pretty simple. Listen what's being said. The second stream is being aware of your own behaviour, as if a mirror's been held up to you and you look at yourself and are aware of how you're coming across, of how you could be perceived. And the third, the hardest, is your own internal chatter. I'll talk about that later, but managing the internal monologue that runs through every part of your life. That's probably the hardest to master. Okay, when you listen to the speaker's message, the first stream of attention, you're listening to what's being said and you're trying to tune into what's being meant. This involves reading the verbal, which is, remember, 10%, the non-verbal, which is almost 80% of what's being said, and that includes body language, eye contact, pitch, tone, volume of voice. You almost do this intuitively. It's going beyond the words that's being used. Feed this back. It's another optical illusion. I'm just testing you out to see whether you can check whether the slides are accurate. So using micro skills of listening, the ones that you would be calling on in order to ensure that you have tuned in and paid attention to the speaker's message are usually these 3. It's a way of checking and communicating that you've heard. So reflecting, people heard this phrase before, reflecting. So I don't want to tell you how to suck eggs, but reflecting is a way of mirroring back, like a mirror, reflecting back what you've heard. So you can repeat the same words they've used, not overdo it because it's a bit irritating, but repeating the substance of what you've heard as well as the emotion. So skilled listeners can, without asking how do you feel, can detect that from observing the way people have held themselves, their tone, pitch, pace of their voice, and they would reflect back the content, the verbal content as well as the emotional content of what they've heard. As well as reflecting that back, you reflect back the intensity. So if someone uses the word very to describe how angry they are, you wouldn't use a little. You would try to match the intensity of what's being expressed. So scales of reflecting back, things like a little bit, quite, very, extremely. So you're trying to match and communicate you've understood the intensity as well as the content of what you've heard. Clarification is something we do very well. It's asking if what you've heard is what was meant, a very useful technique that is probably part of all your practices. It's okay to admit if you're not sure about something. I'm not quite sure I understand what you're saying, so can you clarify? I'm not clear about the main issue here, can you clarify? Asking for repetition, could you repeat? It's a useful way of clarifying. State that the speaker has said you understand, check whether what you've understood is what they really said. So what I've heard is this, is that what you meant? Those sort of techniques that you've probably built into your practices. Asking for examples is a really wonderful way of expanding on what they mean by something. So the other day I had someone say that they were bullied, and give me an example of that. And what the example showed, it wasn't really bullying that they were describing. It was something that they thought was, but it wasn't how I use the word bully. So to minimise the risk of miscommunicating, we could have talked about bullying for the next 2 hours and missed the fact we're talking about completely different behaviours. Open language, open questions, probing. And summarising at the end is a third technique, where at the end you give a brief summary of what you've heard. You don't paraphrase everything you've heard, but the main points. So what we've said in the last half hour is X, Y and Z. Sort of brings it to a close. They're techniques I'm sure many of you already have in your toolbox. Your own behaviour. This is a little bit harder, to be aware of how you're coming across. What are you doing with your eye contact? What's your posture communicating? Have you got your arms crossed? So while you might be attending, is that how you look? Is there congruence between the attention you're giving and what your body's saying? So how distracted are you? So are you checking your mobile phone? Does it look like you're paying attention? You might be still able to listen to what's been said while scrolling through your emails, but it might not look that way to them. Particularly in meetings, I see this a lot. So you see someone checking, they're still paying attention, but it doesn't look that way to me. So is there congruence between your attention and the behaviour you're engaging in? Again, are you conscious of your style, the tone, the volume, the speed of your voice when you're communicating? If you're speaking quickly, is that coming across as you rushing, or is it just a mannerism you have that you're just not aware of and bringing consciousness to? So this mirroring. Internal chatter is the hardest of all. To really pay attention to somebody else requires us to listen to them and not to ourselves. We might not even be aware we're listening to ourselves, because the internal chatter that runs through your life, that talks to you all the time, I think we all have it, it's not just me hearing voices, that tells you, stop talking now, start talking now. Whatever those little voices that run through your life, they can be really distracting. Most of the time our behaviour is driven by the internal monologue that we don't even tune into. This is basic cognitive behavioural therapy, if you've ever heard of it, is all about tuning into the chatter that underpins your life. To listen in an attentive way requires you to manage this. Not to ignore it, but to notice it and to bring your attention back to the person who's speaking. To maintain an intense curiosity and focus on what that person is going to say, to tune into what's relevant to them. And that requires you to be conscious, your internal chatter will emerge, to allow it to happen and then bring your attention back. Does that make sense? I'm going to give you a go at trying that. It's not a role play. It's just listening to me some more. I'm going to speak to you for 30 seconds. And I want you to watch these 3 streams of attention as you listen to me. Listen to what I'm saying, my tone, my hand gestures. Be aware of your behaviour. Are you maintaining eye contact? Are you tempted to write? Be aware of your own behaviour. And as the internal chatter emerges, which it will, to notice it and bring your attention back to me. Have a go at it. And I'm going to ask you to rate yourself of how you think you've gone. 30 seconds. So earlier this week, I was at a funeral, and it was down at Phillip Island, and we had the wake at the Nobbies, which I haven't been to for probably 30 years. But it was a magnificent day on Tuesday. The sun was shining. We were up in the Nobby's reception area with fantastic food, and there was this view over the Nobby's and we could see the seal colony. And it was just the most perfect day. That's 30 seconds. So, how'd you go? Did you think of the Nobby's? Did you think of a funeral you went to? How would you rate yourself out of 10? In terms of managing your internal chatter. I felt very listened to. Thank you. I want to give you another go, and this time I predict it's going to be harder. 30 seconds. Lawyers are overpaid. They add very little value. When they get involved in a case, they charge this hourly rate. It's measured at 6-minute units, even though they usually take 1. Yet I'm charged for 6. How do they justify the fees that they charge? It's over the top. No one else in Victoria, after a GFC, have kept their fees at the level they're at. It's all been reduced except for lawyers. 30 seconds. How'd you go? Harder? Easier?
Started to argue with you. As to those doctors.
You do. When the speaker generates an emotional response in us, it's much harder to manage that internal chatter. It moves from chatter to screaming, and it's a bigger challenge. So I was trying to make you internally scream at me. I don't agree with that, okay? Internal screaming, it's harder to maintain it. So there are going to be times when giving people that level of attention is very, very difficult. But it's still only about noticing this chatter or the screaming going on, allowing it to take place and bringing your attention back to the person, maintaining curiosity in the way they see the world. Why would they think that way? What's about to come out of their mouth? That's the mindset of effective listening. I'm going to do another 1-minute chatter among yourselves, and then there's time for questions, because I'm conscious of the time today. So can I give you 1 minute to talk to your thought partner for the last time today, and then there'll be a time for discussion, questions as a group. Go for it. Before you leave today, if you can think to yourself answers to these questions, we'll have a chance for questions, but you've had an hour to reflect on your communication habits, your communication practices. There might have been one thing you heard that triggered something for you in terms of something you could do differently, something you could start doing that you don't already do, something you can stop doing that you know you do. Do more of, do less of. So as a favour to yourself, just identify that for yourself now, and then we'll move to questions. What are you going to start to do, stop doing, do more of, do less of, as a result of the hour you've invested this morning? But thank you for your attention. Thank you for listening to me so beautifully, and good luck with making some changes to your communication going forward. Thank you.
I was going to ask you to thank Kath, but I think you already have, and from my observation point up here, it's been a most interesting and engaging morning for all of us. Just a little bit of an ad for next week, because you might be interested to know Kath's back again next week with another presenter named Mark Raymond for the business skills point, the business skill. It's a topic, an interesting topic called From Coffee to Client, and it's about how to translate the many coffees we all have with different people in our professional and commercial lives into some actual business, and strategies and things to be able to do to translate coffee into work, making the person a client. So next week, business skills, Kath again with Mark Raymond. So please again finish off by thanking Kath. It was a great morning.